What is up, guys? This is the introduction to this video course on exploration of the live poker player pool. Up until now, we've only really been able to guess at what live poker players are doing on average. And many of our guesses revolved around the idea that they are probably doing something a little bit similar to online player pools in the majority of scenarios. Well, now we get to fully test those assumptions, making use of the world's first live hand history database. So something that was previously exclusively the domain of online poker players, in other words, running population analysis, is now possible for live poker. The live hand history mine is provided by Hand to Note. It's for sale with the newer versions of Hand to Note. And for the first time, we're going to be able to uncover the secrets of the live poker player pool. So let's think a little bit about the database that is going to be used for this course. It contains 465,000 hands, although the way that Hand to Note works, it really counts this as more than 465 hands. This is because hands are analyzed from the perspective of every player at the table. So if we give Hand to Note a hand with 6 players, really that counts as 6 hands, especially when you consider that this is a database where all hole cards are revealed. So although 465k may not sound like a very large database in general for population analysis, the fact that we know all of the players' hole cards means that this database is more valuable than a mine that's even larger in terms of the number of hands available. When hole cards are hidden, we have to deal with what's referred to as skew, where we don't know quite how often the player pool is showing up with certain types of holdings because only some of those holdings reach showdown. And what tends towards happening is stronger hands are naturally much more likely to reach showdown than weaker holdings. So it can be very difficult to figure out what the precise range is on an earlier street, given that some of that range goes on to fold and then we never see it at showdown. In an all hole cards revealed database, we don't need to deal with any skew. We know precisely what ranges look like. So this is actually a large amount of data that we can draw some fairly accurate conclusions on, at least in certain parts of the game tree. Now, in terms of the stakes involved here, they range from small stakes to absolutely eye-watering limits. There are numerous $1 million plus pots in here. The stakes go up extremely high. The most common game in the sample is actually NL 5K, and presumably many of these hands were played live on stream. Now, it may cause us to wonder, is this actually applicable to me? For example, imagine you are a 1-3 live grinder at your local casino, and although there are some small stakes games in this sample, there's also a lot of 5k buy-ins and even higher. There are also games with antes and there are games with straddles. Perhaps players don't really straddle at your local casino. Perhaps there are no ante games, and all of this is included in this live hand history mine. So is this really applicable to the average live 1-3 grinder? Now, I would say generally, yes, this is absolutely going to be applicable. But let's focus on the caveats here. The things that maybe make this data slightly less applicable. There's lots of straddling, as mentioned, and some of these games, double and even triple straddling seems to be quite popular, although mostly we just see a single UTG straddle. And some of these games run with antes, which means the size of the preflop pot is going to be a lot larger. The other big question mark here is whether something being streamed live increases the likelihood that someone is going to do something crazy. So maybe they wouldn't typically stack off preflop with something like Jack-8 offsuit if they were playing 1-3 in their local casino, but now they're live on stream. If they can just pull off this 6-bet bluff jam with Jack-8 offsuit, maybe they're going to go down immortalized in poker history. To be honest, when I first heard that there was a sample size of hands and it generally reached some very high limits, my default assumption is, well, this is going to be slightly more pro-oriented relative to, let's say, a 1-3 or 2-5 game at your local casino. Players will be better on average, there's more money at stake, the quality of the play will be higher than a typical 1-3 game. What I see looking at the data, though, is potentially the opposite. I can confidently say, by far, that this is the weakest population I've ever analyzed in my entire career. And there is the possibility that some of the things that players are doing over this sample, even crazier than you might see in your local 1-3 game. In other words, just because the limits are very high, it doesn't necessarily mean that the games are tougher than the types of games that you're playing in your local casino. In some instances, you might decide, looking at some of the things that happen in the dataset, that these games are actually softer than your local 1-3 game. Then again, that's something that's fairly positive, because if the quality of live poker play doesn't increase that much when we're playing for eye-watering amounts of money, then it means there is the potential there to make a lot of money playing live poker. There are absolutely million-dollar pots in this dataset where players are showing up with holdings that they have no business showing up with based on the action. Also, looking at some of the output, it seems that there's quite possibly some deuce 7 games running. In other words, if you bluff the whole table with 7 deuce offsuit, they have to pay a bounty to you. So that's obviously going to skew some of the results somewhat. Players are showing up with 7 deuce offsuit much more than you'd think they should be. And obviously that's not going to apply if you're never playing with 7 deuce rules in your local casino. The good news is this only seems to affect a very small percentage of the overall hands, but there seems to be a clear peak in interest of getting into the pot pre-flop when 7 deuce offsuit is involved. Of course, there's always the possibility that it's got nothing to do with a 7 deuce game running, but it could be to do with being on stream. That looks really good if you can pull off a sick play with 7 deuce offsuit, for example. It's really difficult to say exactly what's happening without seeing the hand played live on stream. We're going to be analyzing live poker win rates in this course, but we won't be able to see exactly what the win rates are because there is no rake recorded over this live hand history mine. We can, of course, make assumptions regarding what typical rake rates look like in live poker, so it's not too much of a stretch to make estimates regarding what win rates actually are after rake, but in terms of the database itself, rake is not recorded in this live hand history mine. Now, those are all the caveats. Those are all of the reasons why this may not apply. But the key reason why this is going to be applicable is it's very simply the closest thing we've ever had. It's the most accurate window into how live poker games run. It's accurate data points over a large sample size of hands. Is this the most accurate data set we're ever going to look at? No. Is it the most conclusive final depiction of how live poker games play? Absolutely not. But it is the first ever live hand history mine, and this is the first ever detailed breakdown of live player population tendencies based on data. So yes, the decision will still be down to you ultimately to decide what is applicable and what isn't applicable in your local games, but this is absolutely the closest thing we have at this moment in time to detailed data analysis of the live poker population. Okay, so here's what you'll learn in this course. We'll see how live and online differ based on the population data. We will be exploring numerous data points from the live poker player pool to get a feel for how live poker players approach the game of poker based on the statistics. And finally, we'll consider exploitative strategies for playing live poker. We're going to find scenarios where the player pool is overfolding, going to find scenarios where they are overbluffing, scenarios where they are underbluffing, how to respond in different parts of the game tree, and various exploits that work against live poker players. Spoiler alert, some of this is going to be the same as what we can run in an online game, whereas there are certain exploits that apply almost exclusively to live poker. So I hope you guys are ready for the ride, and I look forward to catching you in the course.